you. All right, hi everyone, and welcome to our sixth Weekday Night Bites event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shellie, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the Horror Special Interest Group for the British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies. For those of you who haven't ever attended one of these events before, the Weekday Night Bites are a monthly event that we hold in order to facilitate connections and discussions and kind of cutting edge work in the horror studies field. This afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you're calling in from, we're very honoured to celebrate the launch of David Church's latest monograph, which is entitled Post-Horror, Art, Genre and Cultural Elevation. It is out now and it's published through Edinburgh University Press. The book is the first full-length study of post-horror, which is a quite divisive term that was forwarded by the journalist Steve Rose in a piece that he wrote for the Guardian paper in, I believe it was 2017. Under this term, Rose placed such films as It Comes at Night, A Ghost Story, and Get Out, which he argued distinguished themselves from the broader horror genre in several ways. Tonight, we're going to be speaking to David about the book for about half an hour, then having a broader kind of panel discussion about the debates and discourses around the term post-horror before opening the floor to questions from the audience in the later third of our discussion. So please do feel free to type questions into the chat as we go. You don't have to hold on to them to the end unless you really want to. And we're going to make sure that those get to the panel for that last half an hour. Just to remind everyone, if you're not part of the panel, if you could have your microphones off and your cameras off as well, just because we record these events, we'd like to only have the people on screen that are part of the panel discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to David and our panelists and introduce them all. So David Church is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Gender Studies at Indiana University. In addition to post-horror, he is the author of Grindhouse Nostalgia, Memory, Home Video and Exploitation Film Fandom, which came out in 2015, and Disposable Passions, Vintage Pornography and Cinema, which came out in 2016. And I believe Eddie Falvey has that book over his shoulder at the moment. David is currently completing a short book too on the Mortal Kombat video game series. On our panel tonight as well, we have Joan Hawkins. Joan is an associate professor in cinema and media studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. She's the author of Cutting Edge, Art, Horror and Horrific Avant-Garde, and has written extensively on horror and experimental cinema. Joan is the editor of the Downtown Film and TV 1975 to 2001 anthology, and co-editor with Alex Wermer-Cullen of William S. Burroughs' Cutting Up the Century. Joan is also currently editing 2 anthologies on 1968 and working on a monograph about indie horror. Laura, who is our next panelist, Laura is a senior lecturer at University of Hertfordshire, where she also leads the media research group in the School of Creative Arts. She is co-convener with myself and Kate of the BAFTSS Horror Studies Special Interest Group, and her research focuses on horror cinema, adaptation and seriality. She's the author of Reanimated, the contemporary American horror film remake, which is forthcoming from Edinburgh University Press, and the author of Devil's Advocate's The Shining, which came out in 2017 through Auteur. And Laura's also published on Rape Revenge remakes, the critical reception of horror remakes, Room 237 and Cinephilia, and American Psycho and Gender. And finally, last but not least, is Eddie Falvey. Eddie completed his PhD at the University of Exeter in 2018. He's the author of Reanimator, which is a forthcoming volume for the Devil's Advocate series. And he recently released New Blood, Critical Approaches to Contemporary Horror, which he co-edited with Joe Hickenbottom and Jonathan Root. And in that book is a version of David's opening chapter of post-horror as well. Eddie has also published widely on film and associated media, most recently on sex toys as film reception for The Shape of Water, discourses of smartness in adult animation, and experimentation in art horror. He's currently completing a project on the films of Yorgos Lanthimos, I hope I said that right, and he lectures in the School of Art and Media at Plymouth College of Art. So first up, what I'm going to do is I've got some questions prepared for David, so I'm just going to crack on with those. So I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of start with how the book came together. What inspired you to kind of tackle this topic? Was it a conscious kind of response to Steve Rose's article, or was this something that was already kind of percolating in your mind, this kind of broad shift in horror cinema?
Yeah, it was something that I wasn't initially planning on writing about, and wasn't initially planning on writing in response to Steve Rose's article. I think the first of these films that really sort of caught my attention was It Follows. And when that came out in 2014, and I saw it in 2015 when it went into wide release, I think I went and saw it probably 5 times in the theater, and was just blown away by it, and thought it was just so interesting, and it felt so different compared to a lot of other films that were coming out around that point in time. So that film was sort of the, I guess, the kernel that grew the rest of this project. Although at that point in time, I wasn't really, it wasn't really on my radar that there were a number of these other films sort of like coming down the pipeline, so to speak. It hadn't really coalesced into sort of a cycle, or at least a cycle that critics were talking about until I guess 2015, 2016, 2017, or thereabouts. So, by about 2017, though, you get all these critical discussions around, are they elevated horror, are they post-horror? And of course, Steve Rose is one of the big people sort of weighing in there. And yeah, at that point, I just kind of thought, well, there are enough of these films coming out, and I have, a legitimate interest in so many of them, and find them so fascinating that I might as well try to pull them together in some way and try to summarize some of these critical debates about, does the genre need saving, et cetera, all those kinds of things that were circulating around the very idea of post-horror as a label.
Yeah, and I can imagine when you were writing it, these debates are still kind of ongoing as you're kind of forming this book together. Was that like a difficulty when you were writing the book, that it was still kind of an ongoing cycle of films and discourse?
Yeah. And, at some point I kind of had to just stop myself, because I could still be, writing about, movies like Saint Maud as we speak, and, other movies that are still coming out right now. But at some point, the discourse, I felt like it had gotten to something of a, I guess, I don't know, consensus more or less, or enough of enough patterns had emerged in the discourse by about 2018, 2019, that I could start to say, okay, here are the main threads of this, because what you started to see was eventually enough of a pattern of, okay, some film critic is coining a new term, whether it's smart horror or elevated horror or post-horror or whatever, and then you get this backlash from genre fans saying, oh no, we don't like that term, we think it's elitist or snobbish, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, the films themselves are very divisive. So, you have genre fans who are very often the same ones saying, like, we find these kind of critical terms really unnecessary, but at the same time, we feel very similar to these kind of high-minded film critics as far as really esteeming these films. On the flip side, though, you have genre fans sort of like saying, we want to kind of democratize this debate and sort of like speak on behalf of the sort of like average horror fan. And yet at the same time, in the process of doing so, they were very often, I think, at least, kind of sidestepping the fact that so many like seemingly casual, or what I'm calling populist horror consumers, really didn't like a lot of these films. If you look at something like Mother, or It Comes at Night, or A Ghost Story, the divide between the critical response and the fan response, and then the popular response that you might see on sites like Rotten Tomatoes or Cinema Score ratings from like the opening weekend, those were so far apart that I thought, okay, there's something interesting here as far as like this consistent, or at least relatively consistent, pattern of divisiveness that needs to be explained somehow.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things when I was reading the book that I sort of was struck by is that you spend quite a while talking about all these different audiences, and you speak about them in a way that I hadn't really put together in my mind before, these kind of three main types of reception for horror cinema. And there's a bit in your book where you say that some of these films seem quite indifferent to audience response, and the audiences aren't really encouraged in these films to play that game with filmmakers about when and how, you know, the jump scare or the scare is going to happen. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about who you see these films, sort of who are they made for, do you think? Are they kind of made for your populist viewer? Are they made for the genre fan? Or are they made for these kind of critical tastemakers?
Yeah, I mean, they seem to me to be made more for critical tastemakers and then genre fans, and seem to be a little less interested in what the sort of like more casual populists, you know, multiplex horror viewer is going to be interested in. And one of the things that I think distinguishes this cycle of films is that, you know, there have always been films that have taken art cinema as a mode or as a style or form and combined it with horror films. Art horror is certainly, you know, nothing new, nor are necessarily these sort of like minimalistic ones that I think, you know, mark some of the major traits of post-horror. But at the same time, there's been enough of a consistent like distribution trajectory for these films that so many of them, which might have previously gone just from the festival circuit into art houses and only been seen by you know, people who go to art houses, film critics, genre fans, and so on, or might have only gone directly to streaming services. Instead, those films have found a way of getting into the multiplex and getting seen by a much broader range of audiences that might not, you know, that might go to watch horror films, but aren't necessarily expecting these to be slow, disturbing, ambiguous, and generally speaking, not a whole lot of fun. And for me, I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes a lot of post-horror films, not all, but a lot of them seem to not be interested in providing that entertainment value that I think a lot of viewers come in expecting. So again, not providing those sort of jump scares that people come expecting to experience, those things that sort of like flatter the viewer, you know, who goes in expecting to be playing that sort of mental game with the filmmaker over, okay, where is this next jump scare going to happen, et cetera, and you know, you're not really given that game to play. Instead, it seems like the filmmaker is saying, well, we have other things that we want to approach, different themes, more serious themes, more ambiguous characterization, and so on. And so, you know, then your more sort of populist viewer doesn't really know how to respond necessarily.
Yeah. And I was thinking as well about like the actual term post-horror. I mean, I know it comes from Steve Rose's article. When you put that on something like post-horror or post-punk to, I think there was a discussion I had once with Tom Watson. He spoke a little bit about post-punk in this way. It kind of suggests an awareness of what's come before something. But in Steve Rose's piece, I think a lot of the criticism of that piece came from his seeming kind of ignorance of what had come before and kind of the rich history of horror cinema, which was a little bit of a contradiction because, you know, he's this person that's putting forward this new term, but not kind of acknowledging what has come before. And connected to that, these films are kind of seen in some ways to work against what the genre is maybe primarily known for, but then simultaneously held up as kind of the best of the horror genre. And I just wondered if you could speak a little to those two contradictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that when genre fans in particular tend to push back against people like Steve Rose and say like, hey, there's this long history of horror films that are either artistically, stylistically elevated or artistically dignified or have this sort of sociological import to them. It's almost like, well, you don't need to make that elevating gesture of trying to say that these are somehow not horror films or not proper horror films, or that they are somehow post, like we've somehow moved beyond horror. So you get a lot of this, like a lot of these debates over how much kind of how much of a dissembling gesture there is on the part of especially high-minded film critics like Steve Rose, kind of saying things like, well, these aren't really horror films, they're actually dramas, or they're actually thrillers, or they're actually, XYZ. Now, of course, there are plenty of precedents for that. So like Silence of the Lambs, for example, very often not being described as a horror film, but being described as a thriller or as, a police procedural or whatever else. But yeah, I mean, that's part of it. And then what was the second part of the question?
How post-horror is kind of, in a lot of these articles about it, it's seen as being, like you were saying, this step beyond or this step away from what are traditionally seen as why people watch horror films, but also then held up, like you mentioned in your book, the New York Times bestseller list, the top horror films of this era. And so at the same time, they're kind of, well, we're nothing to do with that genre, but we're also the best of that genre. And it's kind of a weird little contradiction.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they seem to be upheld as representative of the genre and kind of privileged as part of this canon of horror films seen as like safe for people to appreciate, especially people who might not otherwise consider themselves to be horror film fans. But then, of course, the question is, what does that leave out of the picture? And so genre fans will then very often say, well, you have plenty of films that are not quite as stylized or as elevated or as artsy in the sort of, bourgeois sense, but are nonetheless just as important because they're speaking to underlying cultural concerns. Or you get people saying things like, we don't want our horror films to be elevated. We don't think that horror needs saving. We instead feel that there is a sort of a pleasure in the disreputability of the genre. In some sense, it's a genre that should be esteemed precisely because it has long fallen out of favor with tastemakers. So you get these interesting divisions within genre fandom, I think, over to what extent genre fans who do have these much longer knowledge of the history and complexity of the genre, to what extent they are aligning themselves with these film critics and saying like, yes, we agree with you that this is a great film that came out this year, but at the same time, they find themselves sort of stuck saying, but what are you leaving out of the picture when you're only holding up these particular texts as somehow reclaimable as safe or somehow reputable?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I was gonna bring up later on, but you've kind of already kind of summarized it. I was going to ask you about those kind of, the top horror films of the 21st century lists, like New York Times put out, and kind of, what gets left behind or what gets kind of wallpapered over in these kind of debates. And, these films are being held up as well. These are the ones that you should really watch. What do you think, do you think that's going to have an effect in, say, 10 years or 20 years? Are there films that you have seen that maybe don't fall under post-horror that you feel that this kind of focus on post-horror has trivialized or has kind of brushed under the carpet a little bit?
I mean, that's a tricky question because I'm not, I certainly can't tell the future as far as like which other films that are coming out over this span of time, might be upheld as really important further on down the road. Certainly there are some like the recent remake of It that seems to be much more in that populist vein, but is still very much upheld by audiences. And I think by genre fans as well, at least the first chapter, maybe not so much the second chapter. So, films like that may end up being sort of like canonized more or less by the time we get 20, 30 years down the road from now, as opposed to some of the films that are, these kind of acclaimed post-horror films that have gotten a lot of buzz over the last few years. Some of them might not necessarily be as well remembered, once we get a little further on down the road. It seems like a few of them, like Get Out and It Follows and The Witch, those three in particular seem to have already sort of become part of the horror canon. At least that's just my general sense of things. Whereas others, I could imagine something like It Comes at Night not necessarily being as well remembered, 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing in your book, you talk about kind of the possible anxieties of how cultural distinctions between these high-minded critics and then horror scholars or horror fans who have managed to achieve some kind of reach with their opinions, and then your kind of general horror fan, and kind of how those the distinctions are kind of collapsing together in maybe possibly because of the internet and social media. Do you think that the internet has an effect on these post-horror films, in that is the need to kind of take a film and say, okay, this is a future classic, or this is now a classic of the genre, has the need to do that to make those distinctions about films accelerated in our current age, do you think, because of social media and the internet?
Yeah, I think there's been, over the same time period when these films have sort of risen to cultural prominence, or risen in kind of their place in the cultural conversation, that's coincided with the rise of lots of think pieces, lots of blog pieces, things where basically the old guard of cultural tastemakers, their voices are still being heard. People like Steve Rose or Richard Brody from the New Yorker, or whoever else, or the New York Times. But at the same time, you have then a lot of freelance people writing for BuzzFeed or Vice or GQ, or all these different people who are making these big claims about some of these films and saying things like, we're in a big new golden age of horror, or, here are the best films of the last, or, best films of the last 20 years. And most of them end up being these post-horror films and so on. One of the things that I think has driven a lot of this conversation is just this idea of genre fans feeling like, okay, we want to intervene in some way, precisely because the speed of discourse has become so rapid. The fact that, if one of these films comes out, the next day you have 10 different think pieces trying to explain away all the little bits of ambiguity. There isn't necessarily that sense of sitting with these films as like art films and allowing people to just sort of like have the time to mull over what they think about the ambiguities of character, or the ways that these films very often have open endings and so on. And so this kind of rush to judgment, but then also rush to explanation that you see online, is one of the things that really drives a lot of this conversation around post-horror. And so then you find genre fans saying like, we need to, or feeling like we need to intervene in some way to sort of like push back against some of these labels that are being coined to somehow like describe or categorize these films. Or people who are trying to say like, there's a longer history here that's being neglected in some way. There are all sorts of, stylistic and generic precursors that are being treated as if they somehow didn't exist, all that sort of thing. So yeah, I think the sheer speed of film critical discourse, and this idea that so many of these different voices are really commingling in these same online spaces, is something that's driven a lot of this conversation, which is a little ironic considering that the films themselves are so slowly paced. Like the films on a stylistic level or a formal level almost seem to be moving in the opposite direction. Like they are pushing back against this like accelerationist drive toward more and more jump scares that you tend to see with a lot of the more kind of like mainstream Hollywood style horror films. So paradoxically then, the discourse around these horror films, these post-horror films, becomes the thing that becomes the accelerating thing instead.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. I'm conscious of time, and I know that we have to move on to our panel discussion. So I just had one last question. It's probably a bit of a silly one. But of the most sort of recent horror films that have, post-horror films that have emerged since you finished the book, that we could, perhaps say, well, okay, this is definitely a post-horror film. Are there any that you wish had come out just that little bit earlier, so you could have included them in the book?
Yeah. I sort of like put a dividing line right when the COVID lockdown happened, and sort of told myself, okay, the universe is telling me like, you need to stop at this point. Just finish up the manuscript. Like you could keep going indefinitely, but I felt like, okay, this is the time to sort of like draw the line in the sand and say no more. I wish I would have waited maybe a little longer to include films like Amulet, which I thought was really fascinating. I mean, Amulet and Relic, both coming out, right next to each other, and having to do with like, similar issues around caretaking for people at the, for elder care, and like the issues around that. That is something that I think could have worked well in conjunction with my chapter about Hereditary and the Babadook and Goodnight Mommy, and some of those things about like parenting of younger children. So looking at things from like the opposite end of the life cycle could have been a good way of kind of connecting that stuff together. But it's just one of those things where so many of these films are still going to be coming out. I don't know exactly how long this trend or this cycle is going to continue. But also, I should say that by the time that that the lockdown happened, a couple of the last films that I was able to squeeze in, The Lodge and Gretel and Hansel, which is I guess the last one I actually saw in the theater. Those two started to seem like they were drawing more and more influence from earlier post-horror films themselves. So it seemed like more of a discernible style within the post-horror cycle had been figured out by then and started to be emulated within these films themselves. So a little more of that repetition seemed to be happening. So whether that means that the cycle is going to like burn itself out or just continue on, I have no idea.
Yeah, and that's quite a nice way to end it, I guess. If it starts to be, kind of the conventions are starting to be repeated, if it carries on, maybe that was the end of kind of the first wave or the first cycle of post-horror. So I guess it was quite a nice way to end it with those films as well. Awesome. Okay, well, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to ask our wider panel members to switch their cameras on, and I'm going to ask you some questions about post-horror more generally. So Joan, Eddie and Laura, if you want to switch your cameras on. Welcome back. So first off, and obviously David's included with this discussion as well, I just wondered how each of you would personally define post-horror as a cycle or a subgenre. Is there any particular film to you that really kind of encapsulates that term? And are there any particular films or cycles of horror that you think these post-horror films might be reacting against or placed in opposition to? Which is kind of a four-part question. I'm sorry about that. Anyone want to jump in?
I'm happy to kick off if you're happy for me to start. I think David's book. The first thing that we should say really is that David's book is really vital in helping to outline a much clearer definition of post-horror, which up to now I think has been kind of a vague conceptual category. And the term post or elevated horror to me, up till reading David's book, was always a kind of way of identifying contemporary horror films largely in relation to what they're not. And so Steve Rose's article, I think, particularly takes this approach and positions these films as the kind of antithesis to horror films in the mid-2010s that were successful at the box office. And he uses M. Night Shyamalan's Split as well as Get Out as kind of a counter to what he then terms post-horror, which is really interesting because obviously Get Out then went on to become considered as, in some definitions as a post-horror film, and I know David talks about it. So I think we can see that they clearly tend to be posited as kind of art horror films with particular stylistic or formal qualities, as well as kind of tonal or thematic similarities. We might include perhaps restraint, subtlety, slowness, a kind of slowness in the way they're filmed and narratively speaking, but also themes of grief and mortality, existentialism, unsettling, sustained dread, and so on. But I think now, a few years into this, we can definitely see a much clearer cycle of films that are identifiable by those qualities. But for me, the important thing is that there's two key factors to bear in mind when we think about that now. The first is that this is perhaps a type of film, a cycle which some critics latched onto perhaps with some relief after what came in the 2000s. So in the decade before, you know, which many saw as a kind of decade of torture porn and remakes. So there's perhaps a kind of relief that we were seeing something different, I think, from certain critical quarters. The second thing to keep in mind is that the qualities of post-horror really aren't new features to the genre, I don't think. Just like remaking wasn't new, just like torture and visceral horror was not new to the genre, all of these aspects have been features of the genre throughout several decades. But I think we can definitely see that there's a cycle now. So I'm less hesitant to think of this in those terms now. I think David said earlier about there being enough of these films and enough of a kind of critical consensus around them now, and I'd agree. So my reaction to Rose's article has perhaps calmed a little bit, but I'm still quite cautious about it, I think, as a label.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pretty well.
Oh, Shellie, you froze.
She'll be back. Shellie, you froze. Sorry.
I froze. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
Oh, I was just going to jump in, but did you have something you wanted to say in response to Laura?
No.
So I find this cycle fascinating on a number of counts. David was very generous in his discussion of the work that I'd done on art horror, and this cycle in many ways does kind of follow from or riff off of a lot of older trends in this kind of mashup between elevated cinema, high art cinema, and horror cinema. But one of the things that really strikes me about these films is the pacing of them that's so different, and the kind of the formal elements. And you know, I did this work on downtown cinema, which I saw as being very much characterized by long takes, a kind of slowness, often these shots that would be static shots. And so one of the things that was very interesting to me about this cycle was the way that those things were coming in now to horror, which is not a rhythm that I associate with horror, even with art horror. And it seemed to me that at the same time that I began noticing this happening, I also found that when I was going into, we have an introduction to media class that's organized kind of oddly, in that we have, it's like this procession of professors who come in and we each talk about these wildly disparate topics. So these poor students have no sense of continuity whatsoever. And so I'm the genre person. And so when I come in, I talk to them about genre and genre criticism. And I talk about horror because that's my genre. And I usually show them clips from Night of the Living Dead and talk about how genre, what are considered to be genre films, often are the best way for getting at serious issues. Okay, so this is all a lead up. When I'm doing that, I walk around the auditorium at first and I ask the students, like, what do you think a horror film is? What does there have to be in order for there to be a horror film? And what strikes me is that whereas in the past, the kinds of definitions that we got around horror had to do with narratives and particular kinds of tropes, like there has to be a monster. There has to be some kind of subversive treatment of the family, or there's a moment where the monster is running amok and everybody applauds the monster, and then your sympathies shift. There has to be a final girl. There were all these kinds of narrative elements. And what was striking to me is that when I was walking around the auditorium talking to these first-year students, they always were defining it in terms of stylistic issues. Like, for it to be horror, it has to have jump cuts. It has to have a certain kind of amount of violence. And I found this really fascinating. And about the same time I was seeing this shift in the students, then this new cycle of films came out. So one of the things I really like about this book is the way it talks about these films in terms of sort of aesthetic rhythms, and it defines the mode differently than we've said. And I think you also asked us to say like what we thought our favorite films of this cycle were. And for me, it's like a duo. I loved, that's an odd term to use for it maybe, but I loved Jennifer Kent's film, The Nightingale, which was so different from Babadook because it was so relentlessly violent and horrific. But I love the fact that she was keeping that same kind of pacing and that same kind of sensibility, but almost contaminating it with a kind of reinvigoration of violence. And I also love the fact that this mode and this moment that we're in has really allowed for women to participate in directing more than they have been able to do in the past. In kind of big budget films, there have always been women working in the indie horror world, but to actually finally being able to make films that have a budget that are going to be shown in cineplexes, I think is great. It's a kind of a long-winded answer.
An excellent one. Was there anything you wanted to add, Eddie or David, or do you think Laura and Joan pretty much covered it?
I suppose I wouldn't mind adding something. I suppose one of the really fascinating things about David's book is how it kind of, it performs this like really important discourse analysis that both kind of like accepts the term whilst also remaining kind of deeply suspicious of it. You go throughout this book kind of explaining to us all the ways in which there's nothing particularly about post horror, because it's all looking back and kind of observing preceding cycles, but equally you kind of accept it as this kind of discursively constructed structuring principle for understanding the last decade or so of horror films. So that it's as a piece of discourse analysis, it's a really fascinating project for both sort of saying yes and no to post horror at the same time, because I was very sort of suspicious of the term myself, as a lot of people who are familiar with horror films are, so much so actually that when I was writing a project that covers similar ground, I actually went back to Joan's art horror as kind of a term to sort of like to explain the sort of the genre, but also with the kind of the art film modality that seems to be emerging here, partly because I didn't want to get involved in that messy debate. So thank you, David, for taking on the messy debate. That's kind of all I've got to say on that for now.
Well, Eddie, as you know, in the piece that I wrote for your collection, I was very skeptical about using terms like elevated horror or post-horror to begin with as well, because I didn't want to necessarily dig too much into that. So I started by calling them new independent prestige horror or something like that, because they did seem to have this kind of element of prestige, kind of similar to some of the major studio Hollywood films that had come out and been associated with horror, but these also seem to be doing something kind of different stylistically. But yeah, eventually I figured new independent prestige horror is just too much of a mouthful, so we'll just post horror and use it as a shorthand and complicate it. But yeah, just
and in relation to that, I actually remember the anonymous peer review coming back, and basically there was a question about should we really be using this term, and so you're obviously way ahead of the debate at that point. So yeah, that must have been early 2018 or so when that one first went out.
We could always like initials. I don't know what the initials for the independent prestige horror would be, but yeah, we could shorten it and use initials maybe to make it just as snappy as post horror.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask you all is, and Joan brought up the Nightingale, Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale. There does seem to be something about post horror that's kind of like auteurist driven. I think a lot of these films kind of earn their distinction by being auteurist films. Do you think that's kind of key to their critical reception? Is there kind of a tension between reading these films as auteurist visions versus seeing them as genre pieces, do you think? That's open to anyone.
I know that I taught a class on horror in the fall, and this is kind of an odd way of answering your question, but I had an absolute rebellion in the class against post-horror. We had been looking, because we were on lockdown and because we were doing everything over Zoom, and because festivals were also on lockdown and doing everything through Zoom, we were able to, as part of the class, go to the Overlook Film Festival, which is sort of like the Sundance of indie horror festivals in the United States. And a lot of the festival this year was taken up with post-horror or prestige, whatever term you want to use, post-horror films. And after we had been watching them for about 3 weeks, I was getting these very snarky comments in the discussion chat about the Ari-asterification of horror. That was one term that was being used. And at one point, one of my best students wrote in and said, "More dead teenagers." That's what I want in this class, is more dead teenagers. So from the standpoint, at least of my student fans, there's this kind of negative attachment to auteur status. So the way that they were thinking about Ari Aster is very different from the way they would think of George Romero, who was like the other auteur of the class, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really interesting because I've almost found the opposite, particularly with kind of final year students who are heading towards dissertation, who are, you know, desperate to write about A24 horror films as being, you know, examples of new auteurs, Aster particularly. But I think, you know, there's something very interesting in that term seems to have been the term auteur. Obviously, there's a keenness there, and you see it in Rose's article, and I think, you know, in further discussion of associating these new filmmakers with auteurs like Stanley Kubrick, like Nick Roeg, like Roman Polanski. So I think that's perhaps where it comes from. But of course, many of these films, particularly early on in the cycle, were debut features. And many of the people making films, many of the people that we're including in this discussion, Jordan Peele, Robert Eggers, Rose Glass, Ari Aster, all of those were first-time featured directors. And so I think there's something very interesting in this idea that we're using auteurism as synonymous with kind of artistic style, rather than kind of, you know, waiting to see how careers and film work progresses in order to be able to trace patterns across their style. And as we've started to get second feature releases, you know, with us, with Midsommar, with The Lighthouse, and so on, we can certainly see those emerging. But these were terms which were thrown in very, very quickly, and which discourse like Rose's article, I think, really contributed to that, to pushing that idea. Yeah.
And I'm sure it helps that a lot of those filmmakers were consciously citing, you know, Polanski or Tarkovsky or Kubrick or whoever else to sort of justify what they were doing. You know, Ari Aster, for example, has been very effusive about his praise of Bergman as a big influence on his films. So, you know, they're clearly, I think, making reference to auteurs in a conscious way, maybe as a way of trying to do some of that elevating process themselves. Especially if they maybe don't want to get pigeonholed as just being, you know, horror directors, you know, from earlier in their careers.
It seems like another method of legitimizing the sort of films that they're producing as well, you know, sort of framing them as works of auteurs, as opposed to, you know, anything else, is kind of does some of that work of establishing the kind of the art film links as well. And, you know, because so much of this is about kind of like, you know, these salaried critics trying to reconcile their liking for a particular film, despite the fact that it's a horror movie. So you get these squabbles that are happening in the discourse about isn't it horror? And, you know, like even I think A24 themselves like weighed in on a Ghost Story and said, oh, it's not horror at all. You know, but even by you know, in that, they're kind of, you know, bringing back attention to that, whether horror or not horror is the structuring thing that, you know, that determines its identity as, you know, as a film. Yeah, sorry, someone's about to.
It's interesting that when we're thinking about the this auteur discussion, it sort of harkens back to, like, that term had already become problematic around I guess, kind of violent adventure films. I'm thinking like Quentin Tarantino made a second feature, and there were articles coming out, is Quentin Tarantino a new auteur? And like, he only has 2 movies. He can't. It was the same point you came up with, Laura. I was feeling very snarky. He's a child. He can't be an auteur. How can he be an auteur?
And I mean, bouncing off of that, you know, a lot of the creators of these post-horror films, I mean, I know we've mentioned Jennifer Kent and Jordan Peele, but a lot of the creators of these films are white men. And given that a lot of these kind of well-respected kind of high-up film critics are also white men, especially those in positions of kind of clear cultural gatekeepers like Steve Rose, what part do you think that plays in the canonization of these films? You know, are we harking back to, you know, previous auteurs, even in the horror genre of, you know, it's always white men telling these stories?
I wonder if that has something to do with, like, one of the biggest debates that I saw about, is it really horror? We can like it because it's not really horror, was around the Jordan Peele films. And I thought that that was really fascinating. So that, you know, I got very tiresome very quickly. That, you know, it seemed like every review that you read of Get Out was like, okay, it's not really a horror film, so we can like it. And of course, everybody who has been interested in horror for any length of time says, you know, horror has been dealing with these, and it would often be organized around, it's not really horror because it deals with racism, it deals with these very serious issues. And of course, those of us who've been interested in horror for a long time would say, you know, where have you been? You know, this has been, but going back to the 1930s, zombie films have been dealing with issues of race and colonialism and colonization and the white fear of the black male in particular. So yeah, I'm not kind of sure where to go with that, but I thought that was really interesting that there was like this kind of frenzy of hysteria or panic, horror panic around Get Out, and then later with Us, the same.
I think so, you know, the reason that kind of has come about though is precisely because horror is like a controversial genre. Like, it's, you know, it includes extreme content, and that's why these kind of like squabbles over, you know, the correct terminology have sort of come about, because it forces people to assume a position on that content. You know, equally something that like you know, a film that included hardcore, you know, sex content, you know, has to be kind of positioned away from pornography as being kind of, you know, valuable for, you know, art film reasons, rather than kind of in the more sort of puerile reasons that you might, you know, choose to watch a film like that. So I do think quite often, you know, the feeling comes from, well, I don't necessarily want to identify as a horror film fan, so therefore I'm going to sort of build these sort of like, you know, build this terminology around it to sort of, you know, legitimize that sort of the pleasure I'm taking in this film.
Yeah, well, like that Pauline Kael interview or review of Last Tango in Paris, where the whole half of the first half of the interview is like, it's not pornography. It's not pornography. It's not pornography. Because I like it. It's not pornography. It's something else.
I think a similar thing happened with Short Bus when that came out. It's early thousands as well.
Yeah, and something similar happened with Us, and Richard Brody weighing in and making some comment like, well, he tends to frame things in a very like almost a genre agnostic sort of way. Like, it doesn't really matter what genre it is or what you call it, as long as it's good and as long as you have an auteur who's able to elevate the material. So he says something along the lines of, well, calling Us a horror film is about the same as calling, you know, The Godfather a gangster film, or 2001 a science fiction film. It's like, it, you know, it seems too reductive to simply use those labels. But of course, then he's simply just trying to distinguish himself and his own tastes by saying, you know, it's something that is being elevated by a good filmmaker like Jordan Peele.
Do you think that like Brody and others make that move because they're still using like these old this old way of thinking of genre. So genre is always reduced to certain story formulae that have to be there, like the monster has to, like Robin Wood's formula, as opposed to thinking about it the way that you were talking about it, as a kind of mode of storytelling. Or
I think so. And, you know, I know this is something that that folks like Jamie Sexton have written about, you know, this idea that you look at something like indie horror, which is of course another term that was used earlier on in these debates before post-horror was sort of popularized, is this idea that, you know, you associate the art film with the auteur and genre with just kind of like crass commercialism. And so there's always this splitting that's happening there. And obviously, Joan, you've written about that in your own work as well. This idea of, you know, what reading strategies get brought to bear on particular films is going to, you know, inflect whether the same content, like shock value, is going to be seen as like the working of an auteur, or if it's just seen as something that's done for the sake of sensation alone.
Right.
I think, Shellie, you mentioned about, you know, the kind of white maleness potentially of post-horror and kind of cultural gatekeeping. And I think two things to say on that, really. Firstly, it's typical of the process of canonization, isn't it? That you know, there are critics and cultural people who kind of make those kind of cultural calls that further cement those ideas. But I do think that horror has always been a really quite diverse ground for filmmakers who aren't white and aren't male. I think Alison Pierce's Women Make Horror book, the introduction to that really kind of rips to shreds this idea of kind of you know, male gatekeeping within the academy and within criticism. And I think what's really interesting about the post-horror cycle is just how many interesting films we're seeing by women filmmakers in particular. So, you know, I'm thinking of people like Rose Glass, like Issa Lopez, like Karen Kusama, like Ana Lilia Mirpour, and presumably by the end of this year, Nia DaCosta. You know, these are names which are going to become, you know, fingers crossed. I can't see it going badly. It's going to be amazing. I think, you know, these are names which are, you know, perhaps not top and center like your Ari Asters or your Robert Eggers, but are certainly, you know, responsible for some of the more notable entries in the cycle, I think. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that.
Yeah. I know we've only got about 5 minutes before we open up the floor to questions from the audience. So I just wanted to end on a question about post-horror, we can call it elevated horror and things like that. And I was thinking about previous terms like death wave and things like that. One of my favorite eras of contemporary horror was the mumblecore kind of era. And David lists some of Ty West's films as kind of secondary post-horror films. And I just wondered, and it's probably a bit of a silly question, are there any films the panel would retrospectively class as kind of maybe the very first kernels of post-horror, and what these films are kind of drawing from? So kind of going back further than, you know, I know David said It Follows was maybe one of the first films that kind of fully encapsulated this feel or this tone, but are there any further back that you see as the very first little seedlings of this movement?
How back do we go? This would be my question.
How back you want,
I mean, these kind of debates have always raged around horror, and examples of you know, art horror have existed through the decades, and I think, you know, in terms of progenitors, like you know, again, Rose mentions Roman Polanski, Rosemary's Baby, Stanley Kubrick, The Shining. And these are films which over time have become understood that way, but you know, Kubrick's film was not understood as an elevated horror pick at the time that it came out necessarily. That is around, you know, cultural reappraisal, critical reappraisal, sorry, and kind of the way that we've continued to kind of talk about that film and analyze it. But if you go back and you look at TV spots for The Shining in 1980, it is absolutely being marketed as a horror movie, as a Stanley Kubrick horror pick. So, you know, there's something new and exciting and artistic about the fact that this is a horror flick by Stanley Kubrick, but it is being marketed as a horror film, as a you know, as a potentially good time Friday night horror movie. Go see it. Like there is something. So there is something I think that has certainly existed throughout the genre's history in terms of how we rethink those ideas. But in terms of, I don't know, in terms of its kind of most recent cycle and this identifiable cycle now, yeah, I don't know what we'd go with as its kind of earliest indicators. It's probably David, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I always, when writing the book, came back to, you know, The Shining, Rosemary's Baby, Don't Look Now, even going back to something like Gaslight back in 1944. Yeah. But as far as some of the more recent ones, I've always kind of thought of the Japanese film Pulse as being, you know, the Kiyoshi Kurosawa film, as being obviously very much in line with the kind of East Asian, you know, Japanese horror focus on technology and technological fears of that point, but it seems to be moving away from some of the more generic qualities. And by the time you get to the end of that film, it's just such like a sad, empty world that these characters are drifting through. And that to me feels a little more like the feeling that you get with this kind of, you know, lingering sense of dread in a bunch of these post-horror films that came along, you know, another 10, 15 years down the road.
You know, I hadn't really thought about can you hear me okay? I hadn't really thought about the Japanese influence on those films before, but even as we're talking now, I was thinking about the fact that Japanese horror over the past number of years, rhythmically it's structured so differently from Western horror that, you know, my husband was not a big horror fan, and I remember I was watching Audition, and he came into the living room while I was watching it. And for the longest time, that film just looks like a thriller. And I kept telling him, like, you're not going to be happy if you stay. You're really not going to be happy if you stay. But he got hooked into the story and he stayed. And then he was really not happy that he stayed because, of course, the end is so slow and kind of dramatic and building and thriller-esque. And then at the end, it's just like boom, 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 boom. And I remember him looking at me with these big doe eyes, like, you betrayed me. Like, no, I told you this was not it. But that sense of the pacing, that lead in with the slow pacing, it seems to me maybe has some influence on the way that this kind of horror is unfolding. And then absent the, you know, the pileup of violence at the end, that same sense of bottoming out, where at the end, you know, the best thing, like the end of The Ring, the best thing you get is that, you know, you take all of the video equipment over to Grandpa's and have him watch the tape too. And then he has to find somebody to show it to.
Very deeply depressing ending.
I was just thinking about how there seems to be this ongoing mission in like horror studies to kind of mark everything out in like a series of cycles. And there's a few interesting filmmakers who cross over. And the one I was just thinking of for thinking about, you know, precursors to post-horror was Claire Denis, who's often, you know, discussed as an auteur. And certainly like Trouble Every Day kind of has its roots in the sort of the extreme and the torture porn era and stuff. But then you look at a film like High Life, which comes out slap bang in the middle of the post-horror cycle, and you can sort of see this sort of like interesting, like, you know, a figure who, if we're still going to use the term auteur, like definitely, you know, fits the bill. Sort of working in both of these modes, I think is quite interesting. Another one, just one more that comes to mind, The Others, as a post-horror film. I was thinking about that the other day, and how The Others with Nicole Kidman seems to sort of fulfill a lot of the same sort of sort of narrative style, and other elements that we associate now with this format.
And the vampire films that Jamie Sexton writes about too.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. They've been coming in thick and fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the ones that have been posted in the chat as we've gone along, and then hopefully get to some other people's as well. So I don't know who this is from, and I think it's to all of the panel, anyone can ask. It's equally problematic to make a populist versus artistic distinction within other genres. Is it more acceptable, for example, to just be as being light-hearted? Everyone's gone very quiet.
We'll be polite.
I tend to think that almost because genre films, especially given the older iteration of genre movies, have always had this sort of air about them of not being serious, of being disreputable. They're formulaic, they're cookie cutter films. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. And so I think that almost with every genre you can point to like those films that critics bend over backwards to say, okay, so this isn't that kind of comedy. So there's a difference between Jacques Tati and Jerry Lewis, for example, or there's a difference in, we were talking about sci-fi before, like there's a difference between 2001 and the kinds of sci-fi movies they were showing on creature features. So yeah, I think that there's always this trend. It's easier to see with body genre films because we have such a strong investment in removing anything that has to do with body genre from what are considered to be the higher elevated realms of artistic stuff. So, like in my book, I talk about the fact that there's this whole period where people are bending over backwards to try to talk about art cinema in terms of like that women's bodies, violence visited upon women's bodies in art horror. It's not really, we're not supposed to take the woman's body literally. We're supposed to read it as an attack on the capitalist system. And that's why an anal rape is happening in this otherwise elevated film. While at the same time, really the same chronological time, the same era, people were bending over backwards to say, no, in low genre films, bodies can only ever be read as literal. So at the same time that violence against women in the media were picketing films by people like Brian De Palma, they were still accepting the fact that Godard could have, very violent scenes against women in his films, or Bertolucci, and again, they would be read as attacks on the capital. It's the capitalist system that's getting fucked in the ass, not this one.
And I think related to that, sort of what you were just saying, we have another question from Jen that says, I'm thinking of how explicit gore works to give a kind of legitimacy to art horror. I'm thinking of how much the interviews for Violation, for instance, focus so much on how the actress had to learn to throw up with salt water, the long tortured male body, etc. And Jen's also thinking about Raw in that respect as well. So how do you think explicit gore works to give a kind of legitimacy to art horror?
I've just gone back up, and that one is directed to David. Just for.
Oh, is it? Sorry.
That's okay.
I mean, I think that even though most of the post-horror films are not really moving in the explicit gore direction, I mean, there are some exceptions. Ari Aster's films, for example, and Raw is maybe another exception to that as well. But yeah, I mean, I think there's often been this way of reading extreme gore as potentially being reclaimable through an art horror lens, if you look at like the new extreme cinema. So something like Violation, even though I haven't seen it yet, it seems to be, at least from the promotional materials, a little more in line with those new extreme films like irreversible and things like that. That we're really just kind of taking something old like I Spit on Your Grave and trying to sort of like art it up in some way. So, you know, some people who were really into it for the genre aspect could go see it in that regard, but then some film critics would be able to say, oh, well, it's a slice above. It's not just simply doing what I Spit on Your Grave did, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know, because I haven't seen that one yet.
I feel like the new Saw film is trying to at least sort of give a sense of being sort of associated with post-horror. The poster looks certainly looks that way. Is it called Spiral or something like that, I think? Which would be an interesting kind of like, you know, collapsing of the two back-to-back cycles into each other.
Yeah, and the trailer came out yesterday for that, and I think you're right. I think it is doing something where it's kind of trying to align itself with kind of contemporary trends, while still kind of harking back to some of the things that people love about that series. So yeah, definitely an interesting example.
Which is interesting when there's like a familiar property like that, because like the Suspiria remake and the Halloween reboots and stuff like that, which both have kind of like indie auteurs attached to them and stuff, you have the sort of familiarity of the older property sort of given both a sort of new sort of post-horror sheen to an extent, maybe Suspiria more so, but keeping the gore intact. Like I was quite surprised by just how violent the most recent Halloween film was. Especially considering the first one is famous for not being particularly bloody.
Yeah.
A little bit of a change of topic area. So Simon was wondering about the relationship between post-horror and TV and the influence of post-horror with TV. He's thinking in particular of HBO's adaptation of Stephen King's The Outsider, which seems very much to include the kind of stylistic traits that Joan spoke of, and Twin Peaks season 3. Is it possible that TV is responding to this idea of post-horror? Or is it possible that perhaps TV has led it in some ways? And he says, I suppose what I'm asking is, does TV complement or problematize the notion of post-horror?
I mean, it would seem to me like The Haunting of Hill House would be a good example of someone who, you know, Mike Flanagan sort of cutting his teeth doing some of the post-horror type stuff early in his career, and then getting this other property to work with, where, you know, the way that he expands upon the Shirley Jackson source material does so in such a way that it's delving into a lot of these themes around guilt and grief, you know, grief and mourning and things like that aren't quite as much the focus of the original novel. That could be maybe one way where you see some of that influence coming in, even though obviously he has quite a few jump scares, at least in certain episodes.
I was just thinking how Hannibal kind of slightly precedes post-horror. That was about 2013 or so. Because American Horror Story and all that, I sort of link more closely to like the meta slashers and stuff of the 90s, like Scream and all that. Whereas Hannibal definitely bears some of the characteristics and slightly predates, you know, even those earlier films like It Follows and The Witch.
Yeah. Kat Lester has asked, and this is to any of the panel, I believe, another relevant characteristic here appears to be age. The recent debates about post-horror seem very reminiscent of previous instances where filmmakers and or critics have tried to distance horror from any childish or juvenile associations in order to reassert it as adult and thus respectable. And she's given an example here of Philippa Antunes and how she details how this occurred in critical responses to horror in the 1990s in her book, Children Beware. Do the panel members have any thoughts on this particular aspect of post-horror, the way it's distanced from the supposedly negative connotations of immaturity and childishness?
I suppose one of the ways in which we might think that it does that is that the collective horror term, which post-horror is supposed to be distanced from, is quite often used synonymously with slasher. I think when a lot of critics who don't necessarily understand the genre or don't particularly care about the genre are talking about horror films, they tend to be talking about, you know, vampires, zombies, or slashers. And so there is a suggestion that those films, slashers particularly, are there, you know, for a teen market, and that post-horror films are kind of something alternative for your adult market. Yeah, I think that we might see it in terms of kind of, you know, subgenre, subgeneric distinctions or cyclic distinctions like that, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like the way that some critics were discussing post-horror films, I'm thinking of Jason Zinnemann writing in the New York Times, talking about them as being very much, you know, films that are playing on parental fears or adult fears. So fears of losing children, or fears of you know, grieving elderly parents, or things like that, you know, where deaths are treated as not just these sort of like sensational, you know, disposable characters, like, again, you might associate with the slasher film, but instead that the deaths of certain characters take on much more narrative weight, and there's much more of a focus on the unpleasantness of the mourning process depicted in a bunch of these films. He says, for example, that you know, a death of a family member is like the new version of what in these other horror films would be a bunch of teens driving out to a cabin in the woods, right? It's like an almost rote narrative setup in a lot of post-horror films. But of course, yeah, there are plenty of exceptions to that we can look at, you know, going back to Rosemary's Baby or The Shining or Don't Look Now, especially.
It goes back to that question about kind of legitimizing enjoyment of horror, and, you know, linked to the auteur and stuff. And I suppose one of those things where, you know, the family horror film kind of problematizes that is where seriousness is kind of taken to mean substance and therefore quality as well. And obviously, you know, with children's horror films being largely more lighthearted than adults horror films for like mature audiences, I suppose that's one thing. But, you know, I don't know, a case could probably be made that Coraline fits in here somewhere. I don't know, maybe that's the first post-horror film. Don't quote me on that.
Tristan has had their hand up for a really long time. So Tristan, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hello, it's a really question for David and his new work. I'm particularly interested in the emerging cultural appreciation of these key films you're talking about. And it reminds me of the theories you applied in Grindhouse Nostalgia, and in particular Disposable Passions, in terms of how that nostalgia and how that cultural appreciation emerged. And I was curious, did that hold you in good stead, and did that thread back to how new emergence of new appreciation, both mainstream appreciation and critical mainstream appreciation, is developing with these key films which are featured in your new book? Sorry if that sounded a bit wonky, but there you go, I was winging it.
No, I think that's a really interesting question, because I mean, unlike those first two books, which were a little more about the you know, the reappraisal of older texts, this being so much more focused on a recent cycle, there may be a few examples where you can see some of those issues of nostalgia coming up in the critical reappraisal, especially around something like It Follows, because so much of that film has that kind of quasi 70s, like you're not sure exactly where exactly you're located in time, but it seems to be taking place also in present day Detroit. But it's definitely sort of, it's not sort of like an ironic sense of nostalgia like you might associate with a Tarantino film, where he's just sort of like cherry picking his favorite signifiers from the past and kind of reworking them in a film like Grindhouse. Instead, it seems to be an almost like a post-ironic sensibility, as far as like, well, we're taking the pastness of slasher film conventions as read with something like It Follows, but then we're moving beyond them, and we're finding some other ways to sort of like play upon different affects around, you know, loss of trust, around sexual politics, around all sorts of different things that we might associate with the slasher film in a more sort of entertainment mode, but here they're being depicted or treated in a more sort of like serious, dramatic way, I guess. And so, sorry, that was probably a convoluted answer. There's something about the nostalgic tenor of that film in particular that I think maybe opens up some of these issues. And you maybe don't see that to quite the same extent with some of the others, although certainly a case could be made that, you know, watching a film like Midsommar, you're getting obviously so much influence from The Wicker Man that it can't help but feel sort of nostalgic while you're watching it.
Another question we've got is David's mention of pulse and fears around communications or computer technology has me thinking that explorations of such fears and concerns and technologies such as phones, video, digital media, haunted media, etc., seem to be absent from all of these post-horror case studies. I wonder if there's a connection between explorations of tech haunted media and the youth market mentioned in other conversations and questions across the panel, or a kind of association that sees explorations of tech haunted media as only for the teens because they deal with things like social media or killer apps.
That's a really interesting question. Shellie and I are currently doing some work on this idea of haunted media, or we started calling it dead media and then quickly realized that it's perhaps not the best title for it because nothing's ever really dead in terms of media artifacts. I'm not sure what the answer is. I think really interestingly, those kind of techno horror films at the turn of the century, particularly in Japanese horror, that David mentioned with Pulse, and then Joan expanded on with Ring, and in other films like One Missed Call. I think there's a very clear kind of engagement with themes of technology and of developing technology as a source of horror. And that kind of coincided with that kind of what we might now call a post-horror aesthetic, I suppose. And I guess maybe that hasn't been taken forward. I'm thinking of the films and TV shows that Shellie and I are working with are all very much not what I would put in the category of post-horror. I was trying to think if there was an example from our ever-growing list. I was trying to think if there was something which we might kind of slide into this cycle, and I can't think of anything. So I wonder if there is some in some way you might be right there. It might well be something to do with a kind of youth market, with a kind of particular age demographic that these films are being targeted at. But I do also wonder whether there is again, it goes back to kind of influence and inspiration and homage, and that the films that the works that those films are citing and referencing and building upon are not the films of Polanski and Kubrick and Rogue and so on. So there is some aspect that they are kind of following different paths, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, that's definitely really interesting that isn't a theme that's kind of carried over.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. The discussion of Japanese cinema made me wonder how post-horror is manifesting across national boundaries. Are we considering certain national strands of horror as independent or subsumed by the post-horror label?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, most of the films that I focused on were American or British productions, with a few exceptions. Australia, Austria, France, I think. But yeah, it does seem to be a fairly international bunch of filmmakers who are making these films. But nonetheless, it's, really like, it seems to be certain distributors like A24 who are driving a lot of this into the market, at least in the US. And so in that regard, there's maybe a certain funneling of certain filmmakers or films from certain countries or certain cultural contexts that are only sort of like being brought to wider appreciation, whereas some others might still be just kind of like put out there on streaming services or just through the art house circuit, rather than making that leap into the multiplex.
Yeah, I think we've probably got time for a couple of last questions. So Kate has asked David, you mentioned the experimental music in The Witch in the first chapter of your book and the apprehension machine. Is experimentation with sound and music a consistent trope across the films that you've termed post-horror for you?
I think they have a very kind of ambient use of music throughout, where it's you don't have necessarily the same sort of traditional orchestration of instruments used that you might find with a more Hollywood style horror film. There seems to be different types of instruments used, or different ways of approaching sound. So in the chat, Jamie brought up Barbarian Sound Studio, which is another interesting example of kind of like broadcast collage aesthetic brought to bear on sound, but obviously older forms of sound. So yeah, I think part of what makes these films often feel sort of dread-inducing or difficult to sit through in some sense is the sense that we feel sort of adrift in these soundscapes that are not necessarily tied to traditional types of instruments. And so even though it might not be true in all of the post-horror films, it does seem to be a recurring thread that the scores are very minimalistic as well, and oftentimes synthesizer based or drone based, or things like that. I'm thinking of like the score for Hagazusa, for example, which is just basically a couple of low drones for the whole thing.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And another example, I think another really good example of that same kind of idea would be Hereditary. I think the score for Hereditary, where you've just got this really the thing that stuck with me after watching Hereditary in the theatre was this horrible sound, which you don't notice throughout several scenes because it's just there, just non-stop underlying droning dead sound the whole way through, and it buzzes and annoys, and then you kind of forget it's there, and then there are these moments where it snaps off. And it feels like such a relief from this horrible kind of oppressive dread that I think the film does so well in the first 2/3. Yeah, and I think sound is really instrumental in that. No pun intended.
Anyone else have any questions? We've got about 5 minutes left, so we've probably got time for one more question if anyone has one. And feel free to raise your hands rather than typing it in the chat if you prefer. Or everyone is post-horrored out.
That was a question from Neil that we might have skipped over.
Let me just look up. So my phone's switched off, so I'm having to go through the chat, so it might take me a second. Hang on.
Oh yeah. Right.
In terms of identifying the more immediate routes, sorry, this one is the one from Neil. In terms of identifying the more immediate roots of the post-elevated horror sensibility of the 21st century, it will be instructive to look back at the semi-regular column in Fangoria magazine in the 1990s, entitled "It's Not a Horror Film." It would look at titles which obviously had a potential fan base among horror fans, but whose makers had somehow distanced themselves from the genre. I've just had a quick look at my own collection, and a random sample indicates that Outbreak, Mute Wits, and Curdled were just some of the examples included. So I think that was more of a comment than a question, but a really useful comment.
Yeah.
I think that the horror adjacent
is
interesting.
Yeah, there is a ton of stuff in there as well. If anyone wants to have a look, like kind of recommendations and just people speaking back to some of the stuff that you guys have said.
Something interesting that kind of that Neil's comment made me think of is that as much as post horror, we might have initially understood it as being a critical way of distancing certain type of horror films and making them safe to watch as horror films. This is okay to watch as a horror film. In some respect, then what Neil is talking about is kind of the opposite. There's a rejection from horror fans and horror writers of films that we might otherwise consider horror. So there is, you know, in both directions there is an aspect of kind of gatekeeping, I think, which is really interesting, that we perhaps don't think about that opposing idea to post horror, which is, you know, what we choose to exclude.
Yeah.
I can't remember the title of it, but there was, I think this was back in the 90s. There was an Italian film that was made that it had scenes from classic horror films that were being reenacted for a new film that was being created. So was it that somebody owned like the Peeping Tom Theater, and you would go in and but you kept having these scenes, like the shower scene from Psycho, but totally reimagined so that this woman is now in this sort of bougie shower that has glass on all sides, and the camera is kind of sweeping around. And that whole film seems to be constructed around like taking old horror, like absolutely horror scenes, and reimagining them as sort of art film moments. I hadn't thought about that film for a long time, obviously, because I can't even remember the name, but it's an interesting film to think about in connection with this.
Definitely.
Maybe that gets in some way to Craig's comment about post-horror being sort of post-national in some sense, like taking films that we might associate with a very, you know, American horror tradition, like things that seem much more central to the genre or canonized, but then kind of reworking them through the international style, I guess you could say. Somehow different or you know, generically different than they might otherwise seem on the surface.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, we haven't had any more questions come in, so I'm going to kind of call time on the discussion. Round of applause for our panel and for David. Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations, David.
Congratulations, David.
Congratulations, David. Fantastic book.
It is a fantastic book.
Great.
Our next event, in case anyone is interested, is on Wednesday the 31st. Oh no, it's not. Yes, it is. Wednesday the 21st of April. And that is the Quiet Revolution, State Society and the Canadian Horror Film. If you go on our website or if you go on our Twitter page, there is information about the full lineup of events that we have for the rest of the academic year. But with that, I'll bid you adieu, and we will put on Twitter when we've uploaded the video of this discussion in case anyone would like to revisit it. But thank you again to our panelists, and thank you for David for letting us host this celebration of his rather awesome book. Thanks very much.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And congratulations again.